Callum Brennan stood at the window of his isolated ranch house, his trembling hands clutching a small glass bottle that contained his last hope for survival. For 3 days, a relentless fever had ravaged his body, turning the familiar walls of his home into a suffocating furnace. Every breath felt like a struggle against thick mud, and as he watched the early morning light catch the amber liquid inside the vial, he wondered if he even possessed the strength to uncork it. This was the final bottle of medicine he had purchased from a physician in a town 3 days' ride away, and without it, he knew the darkness waiting on the other side of the fever would soon claim him. He had spent a decade building this life in solitude, clearing brush and digging wells to escape the pitying eyes of others, but now, his isolation felt like a tomb. Groping along the walls for balance, Callum made a slow, agonizing journey toward the front porch, hoping to reach the bucket of fresh well water he kept there. His legs threatened to buckle with every step, but as he pushed open the door, his breath hitched. There, crumpled on the weathered wooden boards, lay a young Native American woman. Her traditional dress, adorned with intricate beadwork and long fringe, caught the morning sun, but she was as still as the mountains in the distance. Only a shallow, irregular rise and fall of her back indicated she was still alive. Callum knelt beside her, his own weakness making the movement a clumsy descent. When he touched her shoulder, her skin burned with a heat so intense it seemed impossible. She was far worse off than he was, her life flickering like a candle in a gale. In that moment, a profound and terrible calculation took place in Callum's fever-muddled mind. The medicine in his hand was measured for one person, one treatment. There was no way to divide it that would save them both. He looked at the bottle, then at the girl, who was perhaps 18 or 19 years old. He thought of his father's words, that a man's character is shown clearest when nobody is watching. Out here, miles from the nearest soul, nobody would ever know if he took the medicine and let the desert claim the stranger. He could choose self-preservation, a choice most would find understandable in such a brutal frontier. Yet, looking at the way her breathing stuttered, a decade of self-imposed isolation seemed to crumble. He was tired of being a man who walked away. With trembling fingers, Callum uncorked the bottle with his teeth and cradled the girl's head in the crook of his arm. He spoke softly to her, though she was deep in the throes of unconsciousness, urging her to swallow. Most of the bitter liquid ran down her chin at first, but with a second attempt, her throat worked, and she took it down. He gave her every drop, effectively signing his own death warrant. As the empty bottle clattered onto the porch, Callum collapsed against the railing, the fever wrapping around him like a heavy, suffocating blanket. His last conscious thought was a quiet wonder of whether their bodies would be found together, two strangers who died on the same porch for entirely different reasons, before his world went black. Hours passed as the sun climbed and began its descent. Aida, the young woman, was the first to wake. Her body was racked with an internal ache, but the fire in her blood had receded to a manageable simmer. She found herself on a stranger's porch, the white-painted house a stark contrast to the leather dwellings of her people. As she sat up, she saw him, the settler who had saved her. He was slumped against the post, his skin flushed a dangerous, dusky red, and his limbs shaking with violent convulsions. Between them lay the empty glass vial. Aida recognized it immediately as trade medicine. In a moment of clarity, she realized what had happened. The man had sacrificed his own cure to pull her back from the edge of the grave. Despite her own lingering weakness, Aida knew she couldn't leave him to die. She crawled to him, her hand recoiling from the heat of his forehead. He was burning alive. She looked toward the corral and saw a single gray mare watching her with intelligent eyes. Using every ounce of her remaining strength, she dragged herself toward the barn. It took 3 agonizing attempts to saddle the horse, her vision swimming with every movement. Once mounted, she used the landmarks of her ancestors. The twisted cottonwood split by lightning and the red rocks jutting like broken teeth, to navigate toward her father's camp. She rode with a desperation that defied her physical state, praying that her father, Tahatan, had not moved the camp. As the sun touched the horizon, Aida spotted the thin columns of smoke from her village. She practically fell from the saddle into the arms of her father, a man whose quiet authority was matched only by his vast knowledge of healing. Through parched lips, she told him of the settler who had chosen her life over his own. Tahatan's expression remained stoic, but his eyes betrayed a deep curiosity. In the history of the frontier, such acts of selfless compassion between their people and the settlers were nearly unheard of. He gathered his leather satchel, filled with roots, barks, and infusions passed down through generations, and told Aida to rest. He would ride back to the White House alone, guided by her description of the creek bed. Tahatan reached the ranch as the last light faded into a deep indigo. He found Callum in the final, most dangerous stage of the fever. Without a word, the shaman began his work, transcending the barriers of culture and history with the steady hands of a healer. He moved Callum inside to the bed and began a rhythmic cycle of treatment. Crushed willow bark to dull the pain, feverfew infusions to break the heat, and cooling compresses applied to the pulse points. He watched over the stranger through the darkest hours of the night, those silent moments when the soul often decides whether to stay or depart. He saw in Callum a man of labor and care, evidenced by the sturdy house and the well-kept land, and he felt a growing respect for the spirit that had sacrificed everything for his daughter. As dawn's gray light began to filter through the window, the violent tremors finally ceased. Callum's breathing deepened, and the oppressive heat began to lift from his skin. When his eyes finally flickered open, they landed on Tahatan, who sat silhouetted against the morning light. Confusion and a flicker of fear crossed Callum's face, but the shaman's voice was a calm anchor in the room. He offered Callum water and a nutrient-dense broth, explaining that the life he had saved had, in turn, saved him. The symmetry of their survival hung heavy in the air. A bridge built from two acts of mercy. Tahatan promised to stay until Callum was strong enough to stand, a gesture of solidarity that ignored the decades of suspicion between their worlds. 5 days later, Callum was finally able to walk to the porch on his own. He sat in his usual chair, but the solitude that once defined his life felt different now. It was no longer a shield, but a space waiting to be filled. The sound of hoofbeats drew his attention as Aida returned, riding the gray mare. She was transformed, her strength restored, and she looked at Callum with a gaze that held both gratitude and a challenge. She returned the empty glass bottle to him, a relic of his sacrifice, and Tahatan presented him with a bundle of traditional medicines. They taught him the names of the plants and how to use them, ensuring that the next time the wilderness tested him, he would not be alone. In a final act of connection, Callum insisted that Aida keep the gray mare as a gift, a trade for the life they had returned to him. As the father and daughter rode away toward the horizon, Callum watched them until they were mere specks against the rising sun. The walls he had built around his heart for 10 years had been dismantled by a single bottle of medicine and the kindness of strangers. He realized then that the frontier was not just a place of survival and isolation, but a landscape where empathy could forge alliances stronger than any treaty. On that quiet morning, the dying rancher had found more than just a cure. He had found a place in the human community he had tried so hard to leave behind.